This is part 3 of chapter 8, our final part for this chapter. In this section, we will be discussing some strategies that have been used to try to curb drug use, and then we will talk about some sociological, theoretical perspectives as it relates to drug use and abuse, and then we will finish, as always, with our discussion of how political ideology impacts desired solutions. So let's begin by talking about kind of the primary strategies that have been used to control drugs. And the first two that we're going to discuss is interdiction and prosecution. So interdiction is just prevention of the movement of drugs across a country's border. So, as noted in the last video, drugs play a very large role in the global economy, and particularly for some lower income countries, the kind of drug trade, growing drugs, exporting them to other countries is rather integral to their economic well-being. That said, given the correlation of drugs to other social problems in America, particularly like poverty and crime, obviously it has been a priority of Americans to kind of prevent drugs from entering into our national borders. And so, what does this look like in terms of, policy? It's taken on different shapes under different presidents. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk specifically about kind of the war on drugs and what that's looked like over time. Another strategy to control drugs is prosecution. So these are kind of 2018's federal minimum mandatory sentencing guidelines. And so, as previously noted, 50% of people in federal prison are there for some form of drug related crime. And part of what has contributed to that growth in the federal prison population. In regards to those types of crimes is the establishment of these federal minimum mandatory sentences. It meant that judges had a lot less leeway about what types of sentences they gave out for specific crimes. And of course, I think the hopes were, like the hopes behind the prosecution strategy, broadly speaking, is that this becomes a deterrent for other people engaging in that crime. As we talked about when we talked about the crime chapter, it really hasn't worked that great in terms of deterrence. And it has had a kind of a limited amount of success there. And I think kind of the other kind of major concern, especially about these federal minimum mandatory sentences, as well as just prosecution in general, is how very unequally it's applied. We talked about the biases that could exist at all levels of the criminal justice system. Everything from, whose crime gets reported, and then who do the police decide to arrest? Which cases does the DA decide to take on versus whose gets thrown out? Who are juries more likely to be sympathetic to? And then if it's not the type of crime where there is a mandatory sentence, what type of defendant are judges more apt to give time served or probation or community service to versus actual jail time? And so we discussed how there's oftentimes, age, gender, and particularly racial biases here. And that if you then look at these incarceration rates, it doesn't really align, as your book notes, to what we know about actual substance use, which is much more racially equivalent than what incarceration rates would suggest. So that's one kind of major problem behind this strategy. The next two strategies, treatment and education. Treatment has been, post opioid epidemic, has been gaining in popularity. The idea that instead of incarcerating, punishing someone for being addicted to a substance, instead you offer them some type of help, and this is taking the form of like methadone clinics for heroin addicts. Obviously you have your counseling and your group support, like Alcoholic Anonymous, AA, or Narcotics Anonymous, NA. Um, there are limitations, that education can obviously takes more time, or treatment takes more time than punishment does, and has a much more limited capacity. So oftentimes we just don't have enough treatment centers, and it can be costly in its own way. Although, of course, as we previously discussed, it's not like incarceration is also not costly. Um, One thing that is of concern to a lot of people is that treatment, giving individuals treatment, doesn't really change the environment that fostered drug use. So if you treat the individual and they go back to their household or their neighborhood or their friends, whatever type of the unique stressors in their life that kind of contributed to their substance abuse problems, it is very hard for them, to not fall back into their patterns of substance abuse, in those environments. Education is a strategy that seeks to be, proactive as opposed to reactive, or to use terms from earlier in this semester, you can think about this as being preventative versus after the fact, upstream versus downstream. So, preventing people from ever using or abusing drugs in the first place. If you think about, in the DARE program or Just Say No programs of the 80s and 90s, and still continue in many school systems today, the idea that exposing children to this education about how and why drugs are harmful will prevent them from using or attempting those drugs in the future. Data does suggest that these programs are maybe not as helpful as we would like them to be, particularly for the drugs that we consider to be more soft drugs. And so, there are some debates about, is this the best use of resources, if they have not necessarily had this high rate of success as much as we would have liked. Now, combining kind of several elements of this of the previous discussed strategies, is this kind of broad strategy, this war on drugs, that has been kind of, the government is kind of the main actor, enacting this strategy. And your book does note that, regardless of which presidential administration was in power at that time, prosecution has almost always been the primary strategy, that the government has used to combat drugs in the United States. And we see this beginning with the Nixon era, at which time he declared that drugs are public enemy number one, and the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, which still exists today. The, it was created under that particular president, and it largely, of course, foresees the enforcement of our drug laws, at the federal level. Now, Presidents Ford and Carter, both of them, in addition to prosecution, they did seek to provide kind of growing financial support, public support for treatment efforts, which was a kind of change, a shift from the Nixon administration. In the Reagan era, perhaps fitting his kind of persona as a kind of great conservative hope of the country at that time. He defined drugs as more of a moral challenge. We saw the first big educational push geared towards young people with the Just Say No program. And he increased the federal budget to fight the problem. But it went beyond just the establishing of this Just Say No program in school systems across the United States. It was under Reagan that we began the mandatory prison sentences that we still use in updated versions still today. Um, and they began this practice of the seizure of drug dealers' property before they were even convicted. And this kind of was a way of putting them out of business. So even if they didn't necessarily have a particularly strong case, or as was maybe even more common, if there was some type of lack of protocol followed, something that resulted in the case being thrown out of court because they had seized the property. And this wasn't just drugs, this could be everything from homes to cars to cell phones. Because they would have seized their property, the hope was that even if the case was not a successful conviction, that it would make it very hard for them to kind of go back to business as usual. After Reagan came George H.W. Bush Sr. This is 1989 to 1992. He expanded, once again, kind of government oversight as it related to drug use and abuse by creating the Office of the National Drug Control Policy. Um, in under Bush, we were the country had William Bennett, and who is commonly referred to as kind of the drug czar. He was the director of that new office that was created by George H.W. Bush. He was a very staunch supporter of the war on drugs, and some of the kind of inequities that we talk about today, that we kind of point to, that have been reversed in a lot of ways. Um, they were started kind of during this presidential administration. We saw the implementation of some really tough laws and policies. The original kind of crack versus cocaine disparity that we discussed during the crime chapter, was established during this time period, that 1 versus 100 grams for the same sentence. We had three strikes policies. We talked about how George H.W. Bush beat Michael Dukakis, and a lot of that was based on his promise to be tough on crime. We saw the elimination of parole, and so all of this kind of just contributed to a much more punitive approach to this problem than previous administrations. During the Clinton era, because he served 2 terms, his first term in office, there was an emphasis of treatment over incarceration. But towards later years, Clinton also kind of embraced this tougher enforcement of kind of drug related policies. And it was during his time in office that the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 was passed, and it's now considered to be, although it was not considered to be very controversial by many at the time, it's now considered to be really controversial. It implemented several things, including kind of the three strikes mandatory life sentence for repeat offenders. It put a lot of police on the streets, particularly in communities of color. It expanded kind of the death penalty eligible offenses. Um, so it was given credit for reducing the amount of violent crimes that were occurring at the United States at this time. But kind of that trade-off is it, did amplify, our mass incarceration, which we did talk about when we talked about crime in previous weeks. And so, this bill is still discussed today, and you'll probably will hear it still be discussed as we go into this next presidential election, just because of former Vice President Biden's early support for the bill, in the same way that when Hillary Clinton was running for office, she had to kind of answer for her support for the bill as well. When we get to George W. Bush, we see a shift away from the public attention away from drugs, largely because of the shift towards terrorism. And obviously, this became even more notable after 9/11. To the extent that there was still some governmental focus on the war on drugs, it largely had to do a lot more with, the interdiction, reducing the supply, drugs that were coming in from other countries. But even with that kind of focus on preventing drugs from coming in, prosecution was still the primary strategy being employed in that administration as well. And then finally, we have President Obama, who wanted to offer treatment strategy for nonviolent drug offenders. Under his administration, there became a focus on community-based programs, so keeping people in the community versus incarceration. It was the first presidential administration that actively tried to combat the racial disparities that were being seen in sentencing. And as your book notes, was still this focus though on trying to reduce the supply as well as the demand of drugs. But that administration was really the first to have to tackle the kind of final strategy that has been batted about when it comes to drug use and abuse, and that's decriminalization. So it's worth noting it's not that Obama made the decision to decriminalize drugs. He did not. But it was during his administration that you saw states being given, I guess, the freedom to make some of those decisions on a state by state level. And so decriminalization, the reducing or removing of severe criminal penalties that punish drug offenses, especially the personal use of drugs. In America, most of our decriminalization focus has been on, of course, marijuana. So, if we wanted to look at other kind of nations that have tried decriminalization, your book points to two examples. One example where the outcome was negative, and that's Zurich in Switzerland, and one example where it was largely successful, and that was the Netherlands. So, in Zurich, they tried to kind of create or they added some decriminalization around kind of injectable drugs, and a lot of this of course was in relation to trying to stop the spread of the transmission of HIV/AIDS. So they had a needle park, they handed out clean needles, and they, even when they later voted to keep heroin and marijuana illegal, they still decided they would continue to provide small doses of free heroin to addicts and clinics. And the Netherlands, which was more of a success story, was related more to cannabis. They allowed coffee shops to sell cannabis if it was under a certain amount. They required smoking outdoors. But largely cannabis was legalized. And so, your book makes the point. If you're asking the question, would legalization in America of certain drugs make things better or worse? We have competing answers based on which country you look at. When they gave out free needles and kind of turned, kind of a blind eye to heroin use in Zurich, a lot of problems increased: homelessness, poverty, crime. And so they wound up reversing course. But in Netherlands, they legalized soft drugs, which is what we consider something like cannabis, and they really didn't see an increase in social problems. And so for that reason, the policy still pretty much stands to this day. Of course, in America, we already have decriminalization underway. If you look at marijuana, your book talks about there are over half of the states in the United States, they permit marijuana use for medicinal purposes, and then about a little under half of the states have taken steps to kind of reduce or end criminal penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana. So it's not that it's legal, it's still illegal. But, for instance, in New York, they've decided, that there won't be any jail time if you get caught with like a joint, a small amount of marijuana. And then there are some states, nine plus the District of Columbia, where, you can use marijuana legally for recreational purposes. And and you see a map there of the states that have made it legal for recreational or legal for medical, states that have decriminalized it, states that are still like it's not legal for any purpose. And there are both supporters and opponents of this plan. There's some arguments for both on both sides. And I won't go over that here in the video, but I strongly encourage you to take a look at the arguments that your book presents, and consider whether or not you think those are valid, sound arguments. Do you find them compelling? Do you agree with it? It's just worth noting that the decriminalization of marijuana might be in your lifetime kind of what the prohibition and then later the legalization of alcohol was like in the 1920s and 30s. And it really just goes back to the point I made in the first video, right? That our definition and perception of drugs is fluid and changes over time. Switching now to the kind of theoretical perspectives, I'm going to move through these as always pretty quickly. Structural functionalists, when they analyze kind of drug use through a structural functionalist lens, they note that there are some legitimate functions of drugs for the operation of society. They serve both economic functions as well as social cultural functions. However, they also note that drugs used to an excess are dysfunctional for the operation of society, largely because of those correlates to other social problems that we discussed. So they're kind of it's kind of a having their cake and eating it too type of argument, and that's one of the main criticisms is it doesn't offer a lot of clarity, like who gets to decide. Is there an objective answer to when does drug use become dysfunctional if their argument is functional up to a point. And it's that question of who gets to decide when it is or is not considered to be functional that kind of lies at the heart of the social conflict analysis, where the focus is on how, of course, people with power and wealth, how they kind of have the ability to shape, the perceptions of drugs, and this plays out in the lives of people, especially people with less power, in a variety of ways, because they can outlaw drugs favored by powerless people, or if you think back to that crack versus cocaine disparity, they can just criminalize it to a much more extensive degree. The extent to which laws are enforced and regulated, and therefore, people who break those laws are punished. We can look at the biases in the system to see that oftentimes people who are powerful and wealthier are much more protected, whether it is any, from getting a DUI to, serving jail time for a small amount of marijuana. Oftentimes these things disproportionately fall on the heads of people that have less power. Um, Now, of course, a criticism of this analysis is, especially if you're thinking about harmful drugs that are legal, like nicotine and alcohol, that because they're legal, uh, you're largely thinking about the impact it has on people's bodies, their intimate personal lives. It's hard to really kind of use a critical, a social conflict lens to make sense of, the role of alcohol and tobacco in society. Just because it impacts people of all classes and doesn't seem to be structural in nature. And then the final of the theories is the symbolic interactionists. They are interested in studying the social meanings and definitions that people attach to drugs, its users, and it's the point that I've already made, that this can vary between societies. It changes over time. Symbolic interactionists are also very interested in how people come to use drugs. How do they explain, make sense, justify their drug use to themselves as well as others? The consistent criticism of symbolic interactionism is always, because it focuses kind of on this micro level, it misses kind of the broad patterns, especially those patterns related to inequality, the ones that conflict theorists focus on. And then finally, depending on your political ideology, that largely shapes the types of solutions that you think should be implemented to address drug use and abuse. And so your book kind of identifies four different political ideologies in this chapter, and kind of what their take on this problem is. Conservatives. This is best captured by that Reagan era slogan of "just say no." Drugs are seen through kind of a morality lens, and so being addicted to drugs, using drugs, is seen as kind of a moral failure. And so therefore they oftentimes, point the finger at individuals and kind of their lack of strong families or religious values. And drugs are seen as it being a very self-centered kind of pleasure-seeking choice. And so oftentimes, they support the idea of, educating people, so that they kind of don't fall victim to these moral failings. But conservatives also have no problem punishing people, individuals, when they do. Liberals focuses on, as always, reforming society, therefore treatment and education much more so than punishment. Particularly, liberals are more likely to have a tolerant view of soft drugs and are more likely to support the legalization of marijuana. Um, but this doesn't mean that they support decriminalization for all drugs. Most liberals also still support uh, law enforcement for harder street drugs. And then you have your radicals. On the right side, you have libertarians, and on the left side, you have socialists. Both libertarians and socialists largely don't support government involving itself with the regulation or the prosecution of drugs, but they come to this conclusion for very different reasons. For libertarians in general, this is an ideology where people favor the greatest individual freedom as possible. So they usually oppose government efforts to regulate most things. They favor individual choice and freedom. And so for this reason, they believe, that drug use should be left up to the individual. Um, and, and, uh, and if a person wants to, risk their life and well-being, and engage in using and abusing drugs, a libertarian would largely support that they have the right to do so. Socialists also oppose drug laws, but not because they necessarily oppose the government itself, but largely because they distrust the idea that the government has the best interest of all in mind. Instead, radical socialists believe that the government is largely supporting the interest of rich and powerful capitalists. And so this kind of aligns with what we've discussed with social conflict theorists in general. The idea that there's this very subjective application of drug laws and drug policies and enforcement, and that poorer people are more likely to be hit with this than wealthier people. And so that is it for chapter 8.